Welcome back to Unboxing OD. I'm your host, Kenneth Pearson, and I'm so glad that you're here. Every once in a while, you get to sit down with someone who not only understands the technical side of organizational development, but also carries a genuine passion for helping people grow. And that's exactly who today's guest is. I first met Dr. Sai Islam at the 2024 ATD OrgDev Conference, and then again at the 2025 SciUp Annual Conference, where his warmth and authenticity stood out immediately. In a sea of thousands of professionals, he took a moment to connect, to welcome, and to introduce me to others. And that small gesture stayed with me. It's rare to meet someone who so fully lives the principles of connection and inclusion that we so often talk about in this field. In this conversation, we talk about leadership development, the overlooked challenges of middle management, the power of integrity, and how data can tell the real story behind organizational success. Sai also shares how pop culture, from Marvel to Avatar: The Last Airbender, can teach us timeless lessons about leadership and self-awareness. So grab a cup of coffee, settle in, and join me for this thoughtful and energizing conversation with Dr. Sai Islam. Welcome, everybody. I'm joined today by Dr. Sai Islam. Sai is a co-founder and vice president of consulting with Talent Metrics and associate professor of psychology at Farmingdale State College. Dr. Islam has over 15 years of experience providing data analytic, training, and organizational development support to organizations in a variety of workplace settings. Dr. Islam's consulting work was recognized when he won the Scientist Practitioner Presidential Recognition Award from the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology for his focus on science-driven practices in training, leadership development, and talent development. Through Talent Metrics, he has consulted with Fortune 100 companies like IBM and teams like the Florida Panthers. His books on leadership, Leaders Assemble, Leadership Lessons from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and The Elements of Leadership, Leadership Lessons from Avatar: The Last Airbender, were published by Emerald Publishing. His chapter on how to start a boutique consulting firm was published in the ATD Consulting Handbook. And I want to say, Sai, thank you so much for being here. It is a pleasure for me. I have been a real fan of yours since I first met you at ATD OrgDev 2024, and I had a chance to see your presentation. So, thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be here. I'm happy to talk about OD, and really nice to see you again, Ken.
Yeah, it's great. And Sai, and we were just talking about this before, this story about one of the things that has drawn me to you is just your genuine personality. And we were just talking a little bit about the story that really, I feel like kind of like encompasses or really, really brings out what your genuineness actually is. And it was the SciUp conference back in, was it April? I think it was April. SciUp conference back in April. Again, I had met you at ATD OrgDev 2024. I think we had like a brief conversation after the session, and we were just talking a little bit. So it wasn't like an in-depth, lengthy conversation. And then we had emailed LinkedIn a little bit, back and forth, just kind of talking and kind of sharing information, etc. But I remember going to SciUp, and I remember, amongst 5,000 people, new to SciUp, knowing that I only knew like the names of a few people, yours being one of them. And I had gone to the vendor area, and I walked in, and I just kind of was walking around, and I decided to go over to Talent Metrics to just say hello. And I remember there was a group of people around the table, and when I got there, you kind of picked me out of a crowd and said, "Oh, Ken, how's everything going? Come on over here. I want to introduce you to this person, this person, this person." That story really reflects the type of person that you are, and that really set the tone for me for almost the entire conference is having that interaction with you. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that.
You're welcome. And I mean, a lot of that comes from going to SciUp in like 2007, 2008 was my first SciUp, and not knowing anybody there and having to be more extroverted than I actually am. And it's tough. But that first conference is always a challenge, and then it makes a huge difference, I think, to be introduced to somebody. And I know that in uh, the IO field can be friendly, but you kind of have to break the ice a little bit to meet other people and then talk to folks. And especially if I am at the vendor booth at PsyOp, I'm already pushing my more extroverted self out there, and it doesn't hurt to introduce other people to new folks at the conference, to people that are veterans. And I think it makes the conference more fun if you have a more congenial atmosphere. And I know sometimes, like, I'm not as congenial like right before a session is about to start. Maybe I need to be a little bit more focused, but definitely at the booth, it's more fun to talk to people and kind of bring people together and to connect with folks. And especially because we had met at OrgDev. I think that's an important thing to mention. Is like, oh yeah, I actually did meet you. I actually know who you are. And I had no qualms about, like, just saying, like, hey, you can talk to everybody and you should feel comfortable being here. I think my attendance at PsyOp is before they started some efforts like the PsyOp Ambassador program to introduce people and kind of get them into newer, get the newer people more involved in their initial PsyOp. And I think that's a good way of uh, getting people to feel more comfortable and feel those connections in order to be more successful in the field.
And I know my experience, especially as a new time. I remember one of the before I had gone into the vendor session, I walked in and one of the ambassadors looked at me and then they said, "Oh, you're new." I said, "Oh, yes." They're like, "Okay, come with me." And they like just guided me into a room in a circle of individuals that I've actually, collaborated with, since
Oh,
then.
good.
So
Yeah.
it was really, really just a overall, exactly what you're saying with PSYOP. Like it is a group. You just have to break that break through that little bit of that initial barrier in there, and you have to be open to it. And I know a lot of I'm really really introverted. So for me to go to the conferences, like I have to get into that extrovert mindset, and I have to have and that was my goal for PSYOP. My goal for PSYOP was to just really network and meet people. And I think I went to 3 sessions when I was there. So I was there for 4 days. I went to 3 sessions, but I went to basically every single networking event that I could go to. I met with people one on one. It was for me such a transformative experience. And you were a huge part of that, because it wasn't just that. You had invited me to the Hofstra, the Hofstra meeting that they were having, or networking event, and then there was another one that you had invited me to that was just prior to that. And I got a chance to meet a couple of your students, which was again just wonderful, just a wonderful wonderful experience for me. So again, I'm just gonna say thank you.
No, you're absolutely welcome, and you're part of the community. So
Yeah.
get to come through and hang out, and hopefully we get to do it again in New Orleans in April and
Yeah.
May next year. So
Yeah, also yeah, hopefully, but PSYOP is gonna be my annual, so it's like my automatic go-to one. Um, so let's get into the questions here, Sai. So you are a professor, you're a consultant, you're a co-founder, and you are an author. But let's kind of rewind a little bit. What pulled you into leadership development in the first place, especially the kind that focuses on middle managers?
so when I started, when I graduated from college, I took on a couple of roles that were HR oriented, kind of a mixture of recruitment and talent development. I was working for an educational company at the time, and in addition to kind of doing recruitment and training, I was also managing a workforce, and I had no idea how to manage a workforce. I had, like, no clue. And I did as a huge nerd, I did what I always do, which was like, all right, maybe there's a book on something. At the time, there was no, like, YouTube video series to watch. I think now I would probably do that, but I looked for a book, and I found a couple of um, a couple of good books on coaching and leading, for middle managers for particular group. And yeah, I started doing some reading, and I was like, okay, this is helpful to me to kind of organize work, to kind of communicate more effectively. And I used whatever I did, or whatever I read, and I used it in my managerial work. And so that, I think, has always given me an insight into leader development, and then also given me some insight into what managers need and how organizations kind of view things. In a lot of organizations, you end up in frontline management and then maybe middle management because you are a good individual contributor, right? You're able, you're maybe you're an engineer and you're a very good engineer. Maybe you're very good nurse. Whatever the job happens to be, you just happen to be good at it. And the idea is, well, maybe you can manage people, and that is a really flawed way of thinking about who should be a leader and how to get them ready. We see something similar in the world of sports where you imagine that, well, this person's really good at sports. They must be able to coach as well. And the fact is that chances are they're not going to be that good at it. And they need a little support to figure out what kind of leader they're going to be. What sort of leader are they going to be? Some of the work around looking at middle managers, comes from some reading that we did about from Josh Burson, who wrote a paper a couple of years ago about the lack of support for middle managers. So there's support that's given to senior level executives at the C level and maybe a layer right below, but those middle managers, they're just not getting that support because companies and organizations, have been kind of, moving back and forth with all of the different changes that have been happening, whether it's economic, whether it's, COVID, whether it's something else. And that, expectation that, okay, I'm going to get support at every level as I move up, it just hasn't been there. And so, we've been working to try to, fill that gap over time.
Yeah, and that's such a great answer, Sai. Because and exactly what you're saying too, that many of those frontline managers or even up to the middle management level, that yes, they are great individual contributors, and one of the areas that I focus on too in consulting and even in previous organizations, was I mean percentage wise, I don't know what it looks like, but I know that there are a lot of individual contributors that are promoted based on their technical skills, but never given that opportunity to learn those leadership skills. So
Mhm.
now you have somebody that has these technical skills, that it doesn't want to let them go because they don't know what they're supposed to be doing in that managerial position.
Yeah.
So yeah, that kind of leads us into the middle management often gets left out of those conversations, that leadership conversation, even though they're holding so much of the day to day. So what do you think, or why do you think that layer tends to be overlooked, and what do organizations lose when they do ignore it?
Yeah, so I don't think organizations are actively ignoring middle management. I think one of the big challenges is if you're a frontline manager, the company knows here's some things that you need to just get started in a leadership or managerial career. So we understand the start. Okay, you need to know these basics. We know what that is. We know the top level. Okay, here's what you need to in order to view the entire organization. We have a rotation program. You need to learn every, part of the business. But what is there at the middle? And I'll give it kind of a little bit of a strange analogy around this, but like we know high and low are easy to tell the differences between. And maybe some of your listeners have conducted research, and if you've conducted research before, you might have said like, okay, I know when something, when my independent variable or my condition is high or low, right? Okay, I get that, right? But what's the middle? And I think the middle is really hard to kind of determine how much greater is the middle than frontline, and how much less is the middle from from the senior level leadership. And I think that takes a type of strategic thinking that a lot of organizations don't necessarily have, or they don't give themselves the time to kind of step back and say, well, okay, let's actually look at what are middle managers expected to do, what are they supposed to do, and are there bottlenecks that they're experiencing that frontline managers are not experiencing, and that senior level leaders are not experiencing. And I think it's hard to do that, and I think this is the root cause of a lot of issues in the type of consulting work we do. Is the organizations themselves, they are overwhelmed, and they feel like they can't give themselves the time to step back and say, hey, I need to take a step back, I need to think about this differently, let me move this back a step or two and see what I can do. So I think that's a really important consideration for organizations, and that's part of the process of overlooking. It's like, oh, I don't know how to define this. I guess things are okay. And if there were real issues or problems, the middle managers would tell me. And sometimes people in those jobs, especially during a time period where the job market's not very good, people may not be willing to speak up very much. And that's one of the challenges that we're seeing. And that's why we are where we are right now with middle managers, and the type of leadership capabilities they happen to have. One other thing that's been happening as well is companies have been kind of delayering. So, just because you remove layers, it doesn't mean that those middle managers have fewer people, fewer direct reports. It just means a flatter structure where you have more people reporting to you, and that creates new challenges that maybe your existing leadership development program doesn't fully address.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I know they, that seeing the news and seeing the articles, like companies like, Amazon. I think did Microsoft also announce or Apple also announced they're going to be kind of, you know, shaving down those layers in there as well. So I think that Amazon came out and said that they want their managers to have at least 15 employees each, or something along those lines. Um, and I love you talking about the evolution of the leadership programs within the organizations themselves.
Mhm.
Now, do you think that just kind of working off of these the conversation? Do you think that there should be almost like separate levels of leadership development within the organization? So let's say you have a like an executive or C-suite leadership development program, and then you have a director level management leadership development program, middle manager, frontline manager. Do you think that it would be beneficial for the organizations to have that
Mhm.
separate layers? I know it's a lot, so
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it helps because the tiers, the layers allow you to it forces the organization to think about, well, what does it mean to be a middle manager? What does it mean to be frontline? What does it mean to be senior executive within our organization? And once you're forced to think about that, then you can start to say, well, here's what's appropriate. Here's the content that's appropriate. Here are the skills we're looking for. And, in a lot of organizations, because they're so busy doing, there's very little time to strategize, and it limits the ability of the senior leadership and the organization to develop over time. And so when that happens, then you have these limitations. The organization hits a wall. They say, "Hey, we're just not performing as well. The product is okay, but we're just not getting as much. We're not able to address the new challenges that we're facing as the organization grows, and or as the economic conditions change. They're not sure what to do, and you kind of have to reflect during those times on, well, what is it going to take for this organization to get to the next level? What do we have to do in order to get to that next level?
I love the layered
Mhm.
approach in there because I know working in the previous organization that I
Mhm.
was working in, like we had our our executive leadership development program, but then we also had a frontline, so individual contributor
Mhm.
moving into,
Mhm.
and we had started to consider those middle managers and we started to
Mhm.
consider those directors, but it was. And for us, we only had two people that were working on this for an organization of 1,100 in organizational development, focusing not only on leadership, but focusing on
Mhm.
succession planning and
Sure.
performance management and
Mhm.
basically everything that goes into organizational
Mhm.
development.
Yeah.
So I know that it can be difficult to
Mhm.
really build out effective programs
Mhm.
based on time constraints in there.
Yeah.
Um, So where would you suggest prioritizing those that have limited resources and limited personnel?
Mhm,
Where would a suggestion or a recommendation to start to build out those leadership programs if they have the
mhm.
ability to do so?
I would start with pain points. So if you're seeing that performance at the frontline level isn't doing that well, then I would say you got to start frontline. If you're finding that maybe you are losing employees in the mid level, then maybe start at the middle, which is I would say pretty counterintuitive for most organizations. Be like, oh, we don't want to start in the middle. Why would we do that? But really, starting at those pain points, because that's where the value is. That's where the real outcomes are going to be. That's where the real drivers are going to be for your organization. But while you're addressing those pain points, you should start to address just the structure undergirding your leadership program, the things that you just mentioned, succession planning, kind of having it, looking at bench strength, figuring out, well, do we have the people that are going to move up into our organization to lead the future? All of these things are important, and you can take the time to start saying, well, okay, here's where we are seeing a lot of challenges, issues, bottlenecks, whatever the situation might be, and then you can start to say, well, okay, how do we address these? So, the first step might be, okay, we're going to create some programs around addressing this problem, whether it's frontline, middle managers, or senior executives. And then while we're doing that, we need to plan for these other steps that we need to take in order to make sure the organization is going to function effectively, that we can continue our the talent pipeline and build that talent pipeline so people are moving through it. I think that's really important to do. So it's not just addressing the single problem that may be most pressing at the moment, but also being able to kind of take a step back and say, well, okay, we're dealing with this one thing. Where does it fit into the larger pipeline of what we're doing? And once you've done that, I think it's really a good start and good way of looking at it.
Yeah, such a great suggestion. Si. I appreciate it. I know the listeners will appreciate it as well because I do get a lot of questions and I get a lot of, I'm one person working in an organization of 500 or I'm, you know, a team of two or three. And that's really, the individuals that I talk to, specifically in organizational development, they don't have a whole organizational development team. Not every organization does. Some organizations do. They'll have an
Mhm.
OD team of,
Mhm. Mhm.
5, 10, 15 employees in the organizational development department, which is amazing. And I think it's wonderful. But most of the individuals that I talk to, they are a team of one, they are a team of two, they're a team of three, focusing on all different aspects within that. So that is such a great suggestion for them just to start with the pain points, start start with the areas that they're seeing the most either pushback or issues or whatever the case might be. So thank you, I appreciate that. So when we were kind of talking a little bit, not before but talking in emails back and forth, I'm actually quite curious. So you mentioned a story about working with a female executive on her development.
Mhm.
So, and I'd love to hear more about that. So what was that experience like for you, and what stuck with you from that process?
So this was I was working with a healthcare organization, and this was a senior level executive. She was in the C-suite. I believe she was CMO, so Chief Marketing Officer. And we I was working with all the executives at the C level for this healthcare organization, and we were, the thing that struck me about the experience was she was highly capable, very capable individual. Um, you know, uh, we talked a little bit about some issues around management at the highest level, because she was used to being an individual contributor and doing a lot of the work herself, and then kind of finding a way for her to trust her team and letting them perform was really important. But I remember we were chatting during one of our coaching sessions, and I just said offhandedly, I was like, "Hey, you could become CEO." And she just looked at me, and for me, I'd seen her work. I was like, she's very good, she's very capable. But she looked at me like I'd said something really, like really shocking. Like I had just like come out of nowhere and just said some just you know something crazy. And she looked at me, she was like, you really think I could be a CEO? I'm like, yeah, I think you could be a CEO. And that's what stuck with me, is that sometimes in leader development, like being really explicit about what you feel an individual can accomplish is very important. And I don't think that if I recall correctly, she had not heard that from anybody else. She knew that she'd gotten positive feedback, she got good feedback from her team, but nobody had articulated this idea, that, oh, you could be a CEO. And it seemed to violate some ideas that she had about like what the ceiling was of her career. And I think she has continued to perform well. I'm not sure if she's taken on a CEO role, but I think it changed her attitude in our coaching, that she could see herself that way. Now that doesn't mean that you need to tell everybody that they theoretically can become CEO. That's not the lesson from this. But that if you see the talent, to identify and to be clear that it's a possibility. Maybe not that organization, maybe another organization, but as an organization, letting it be known through your performance management, through your succession planning, that, oh, we have an avenue for you. And especially for women, I think that's also a big deal. Is that what we see in the research, at least, is that when women even apply for jobs, if they don't meet the majority of the criteria, they won't apply. And so it was actually very interesting to see like a real life version of something like that, where until I said it, maybe she hadn't even thought about it, because she's like, oh, I need 20 more years, 30 more years of work before I can be considered for this. And then I'll feel the confidence. Whereas the research seems to indicate that men are just like, well, I meet like 50% of this. I think I could do it, right? Um, and so one of my areas of interest has always been self-efficacy. And self-efficacy, in order to build self-efficacy, you have to have mastery experiences. And part of that is recognizing that you have the talent and the capability by which you could actually do the job. And that was what I took away from that coaching experience, is that in some cases you're creating a future version for them that hadn't existed before, until your coaching sessions. So I felt like that was a really, really powerful thing, around somebody who's very talented, and their ability to say like, yeah, I could move forward. I could do this, whether it's here or someplace else. I think I could do it.
Yeah. And the the part of the coaching in there too that I kind of hear and I took away is coaching isn't always about like learning learning different skills and everything. Coaching, again, learning about self-efficacy and learning confidence and being able to hear that you have this ability to do more than where you're at, if you want to. And that's the key in there too, if you want to. And knowing that there's individuals that are behind you that actually see this. And I love the other thing that you're saying in there is not everybody can be a CEO, and not everybody is going to be like that next level, and really being genuine and authentic with how you're providing that feedback to them. you know the other thing in there, that I think is important is the research. And I know we had just done the global work and organizational psychology conference, and I
Yeah.
heard that stated in there in terms of the studies and the research has shown that when women don't meet all the qualifications for the positions, they're less likely to apply for those positions, where as opposed to their counterparts. I have 5 years. They want 5 years of experience. I have like 3.5, so that's close enough to 5, and they'll apply for the position. And that's why I've really appreciated recently, and this isn't a recent thing, but recently, as I've been looking at job descriptions and everything, the ones that are explicit, that explicitly say, if you don't meet all the qualifications, don't worry. Please apply anyway. And it's like, it's just saying like, just apply anyway. We are just looking for, we want the best person. So if you don't have 5 years experience, that's okay. Apply anyway. If if you don't have, a master's degree or a bachelor's degree or associate's degree, that's okay. Apply anyway. And I really, I love those particular job descriptions because it is really inviting. The issue with that is then you get like 1,000 applications on it, but
Yeah.
it makes it much harder for the hiring manager or whatever. But if they're filling those tougher to fill positions and they're specifically stating that, then I'd like to believe that they are looking at all of those applications that are moving in there. So yeah, so I appreciate that, Sai. Um,
Absolutely.
so one of the things is you are, you run metrics, correct? And it's Michael Cheetah, I want to say.
Cheddar.
Cheetah. Sorry.
He
I
runs.
always mess up.
He runs away from work like a cheetah, but you know,
I
there
love
was
that. I
no
love
Cheddar's the way to go.
that. Okay.
Sometimes we
Okay.
call him cheddar cheese. It happens. So
Yeah. And I had a chance to meet him
yeah,
at SciUp as well, and just very very fun personality there,
yeah,
very New York based. So I'm from the Northeast, and
yeah,
you're in the Northeast in the New York area.
yeah.
So New York, New Jersey. I know I believe he's from Long Island or New York City.
He grew up in Queens, lived in Long Island
Yeah.
for a while. Now he's in Florida. Now he's
Yeah.
slowly morphing into a Florida man. So
Okay.
we'll
Okay.
see.
But it was just whenever it's funny because I live out in Arizona now, and I
Mhm.
hear I hear a lot that when you know out here, I'm talking, you can't really hear my accent. But once I start talking to people from New York and New Jersey, it
Mhm.
just comes flying back, it
Yep.
takes me when I go to visit my family, it takes me about
Mhm.
a week or so to get back to
Uh-huh.
out of the New York style accent there. So,
Yep. Yep.
um, but yeah, so you run talent metrics, and the name alone says a lot. So, but when we talk about data in OD, it can mean a lot of different things. So,
Mhm.
what does using data well actually look like in the work that you do?
So a lot of times in our consulting work, the important piece is asking the right questions and then looking at the data that either the organization has currently or the data we plan on collecting and saying, is this the right data to address this question? The question that we happen to have. So if it's a question of leadership, do we have, survey results? Do we have departmental performance? Do we have other data that we can look at to diagnose a problem and then assess and then develop a solution? So the goal should always be refining questions. A lot of times, especially if you use a vendor, a survey vendor, or something else, what you find is that there's, that the survey vendor or whoever else that you work with, they've got data for you, but it may not address the question that you happen to have. And so the key thing is to start with the question. What is it that you're looking for? Is it, are there problems that are happening within the organization that you want to address? Is there, is productivity down? Is there something else? What are those questions? And once you have those questions, then you can map your data and your data needs to those questions and then move forward from there. I started my career in training and development, and we talk a lot about instructional objectives in training and development. It's like not the most exciting thing to talk about, but really important because the instructional objectives tell you here's what the program's going to do, here's what it's going to accomplish. In the same way, your data strategy should be around those questions around what the organization needs. And you see this really often in departments like marketing, in departments like finance and accounting. They have very clear questions with data tied to those questions. But in human resources and organizational development, because you're dealing more explicitly with people, the questions then become hazier and it becomes more challenging and trickier to kind of do that. So that's one of the big challenges that we face, and usually when people ask me about data, I think everybody expects me to give like some sort of mathematical equation as an answer, and I just say, well, can you answer questions effectively? Can you actually ask a question that makes some sense in this case? Um, and in a lot of times getting clients to refine those questions is one of our biggest challenges before we've collected any data.
For me, I love data. It's not like I'm making only decisions on that, but it allows me
Mhm,
to identify some of those pain points. For example, if we're looking for communication,
mhm,
up and down, upward and downward communication. We can say, okay, like,
mhm,
what does it look like at the top here from their top, and what does it look like in the middle here from their top, and then what does it look like on the front line? And I know we had done one in my previous employment place that I was employed in, and again, like, it was, you saw the disconnect, from the layers, you saw the
mhm,
disconnect. And then what we were able to do is we were able to, I mean, I'm simplifying it as much as I possibly can. But what we're able to do is we were able to develop some like initiatives and some like trainings and stuff like that that would kind of, you know, feed into it and kind of address those particular pain points in there. And
mhm.
again, I'm simplifying it because it's not simple, but um, yeah, so like I feel like people either get really excited about data or just kind of completely shut down with it. So how do you help teams move past the spreadsheets and actually connect the dots between the numbers and what they should be doing differently?
So yeah, I've been teaching stats for a really long time. So seeing people shut down around data is a pretty common thing. So making data seem feel real to them is extremely important. So rather than making it seem like, well, here's some numbers, now I want you to make decisions around that. I think they have to be real, and we see this in a variety of different settings. Football season just started. The Giants lost, so obviously I should talk about fantasy football, right? But people understand, even people who don't really like follow football that well, they understand what those numbers mean. They understand how to, evaluate players that they want to draft, who they want to put in. Um, and it's because those numbers are real. We see that in sports all the time. You know what a score is, you know what a penalty is. Those things are real for you, and so if you can make the data real for the individual, for the teams overall, so that when they get a number, they can say, okay, this is what this means. If you've ever had to like explain, blood pressure to somebody, right? Blood pressure is a number you kind of have a sense of, oh, this is good, this is bad. But if you really want to create a change for yourself, you need to understand what those numbers actually mean and be able to take action on them. If you can illustrate that, that becomes powerful. And so then it becomes less about, well, okay, I don't know how to calculate this number, I don't know how to do this, to, oh, okay, I here's what the number's telling me, here's what I have to do. And we look at numbers all the time, and we know what those numbers actually mean, and we act accordingly. Oh, the temperature is this, here's the clothing that's appropriate for this environment at this time. I understand what that number means. And so if you can explain those numbers to clients in that way, they can usually take pretty good action.
Yeah. And I love the fantasy football reference. Exactly what you're saying too. That I don't think I've watched a football game,
Mhm,
in its entirety in however long, but I have my fantasy football teams. And I know statistically, who is the in terms of probability, who is going to be
mhm,
better, who's
mhm,
going to have a good week. It's
mhm,
knowing that it's not just the numbers. It's the numbers speak to us, and the numbers actually say, this is the probability or this is where the issue is. And then being able to look at it from the one thing about, we talk about this and
mhm,
on this podcast and this human-centered approach.
mhm,
It gives us the ability to identify some of the areas where there might be, some really positive experiences that people are
mhm,
having on the human level, and some areas that are needed for improvement on the human
mhm,
level.
mhm,
And data gives us that, but if we're running just only solely on data, and
mhm,
not looking into,
mhm,
the root cause of an issue. And I think I've talked about it on this show before as well. We had developed at my previous place of employment, we had developed a retention. So for new hires specifically. So we
uh-huh,
had done, a 6 month, 6 month. 6 to 12 month, 12 to 24 month, and 24 plus month. Just a basic. But we wanted to see like what was happening, where the new hires, as a percentage of them were leaving before the 6 month, before the 6 to 12, after the
Mhm.
6 to 12
Mhm.
months, and we wanted to kind of categorize them.
Mhm.
Once we had a little bit more data, because we started that going back a little bit, we had started that, and we had almost 2 years worth of data. And then by the time I left, we had about 3.5 years worth of data, which is really
Wow.
good, a good data set to have. But we were able to actually identify it down to not just the department, but down to the program, down to the manager. So we were actually able to get it down to the manager, and we noticed that there was this area that they were having a difficulty retaining employees, beyond the 6 month marker. So instead of saying, well, you're not performing well and you're not doing this and you're going to get a write up or whatever, we got to the root cause of it, and we found out that one, they didn't have a great onboarding process once they left HR and they went into the
Mhm.
workplace. Even during their interviews, their interview questions um, weren't really giving the individuals that were coming into the organization that they were
Mhm.
interviewing
Mhm.
a real good understanding of what they would be doing. Um, so it's kind of like they were walking in, and then when they were leaving, they were like, "This is not what I signed up for." So it was like that type of. We were doing exit interviews and
Mhm.
that kind of stuff
Mhm.
too, um, but this is what it was. So we were able to kind of address that a little bit. And we
Mhm.
noticed, again, instead of getting the manager in trouble
Mhm.
for losing all these employees or whatever the case was,
Mhm.
we
Mhm.
were able to work with this individual to get them to build up their program. So and build up their retention, and they did. They did a really
Mhm.
really wonderful job.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
we tracked that for a full year as they were uh, interviewing and hiring new individuals within their program. So, data really is such a wonderful. I mean, again, people will say, data, I don't like it, but data is such a great place to say, yes, this, kind of connect the dots and everything, and say that and really guide the
Mhm.
decisions and the interventions and the initiatives
Mhm.
that can really help organizations out. So,
So I just want to piggyback off that a little bit because what you just described is you had a real problem, actual clear problem. There's a retention issue here. You spoke to it, and then you use data to kind of fill fill that gap. And the leader, the manager, they didn't have to worry about calculating it. You calculated it in the same way that, like in fantasy football, people are not calculating QB rating on their own, right? They know what it is. They probably most majority of people probably can't calculate it themselves, but it doesn't matter. You know what the number is. You're going to use it, and then you're able to draw connections to other parts of the business to say, okay, here's where this retention issue is. Let's target that and let's focus on it, and then we can move forward from there.
this is why OD and
Mhm.
IOs are so important within organizations. I mean, so important within them. And I will advocate for that.
Mhm.
Yeah, as long as I'm in this field, I will absolutely advocate for that. Because these are the individuals that can be trained and that are trained in these particular areas to see these, to see the data and to calculate the data and to come in and talking about fantasy football and NFL stats.
Mhm.
And I'm a
Now,
baseball fan too, so I
Mhm.
mean, they have all kinds of stats that are so much different than the '90s, when 80s, '90s, 2000s. Now I'm looking at some of those stats. I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about at this point, but I'll trust you on it. I'll trust you on it. I'll trust you that this is a really important stat to but that's what it is, having those individuals to be able to interpret that and having everybody to say, okay, everybody knows that, 50% retention rate,
Mhm.
after, before 6 months is not good. That's just not good. I mean, people know, like, instead of saying, you've hired 10 people and five of them have left before the 6 month marker. There's something going on here. People know what 50% is. And again, that's a simple calculation there.
Mhm. Mhm.
But being able to have somebody come in and be able to interpret that for you and just give you the numbers that
Mhm.
people understand. And again, presenting the numbers to those individuals that might not understand the statistical, information. I know we talk about research methods, and you start getting into all those, in IO doing,
Mhm.
tests and that, all that kind of stuff. So,
Mhm.
but speaking the language of the organization, so they can
Sure.
understand what those statistics mean, so that it's more universal. So they can say, okay, well, my rate has gone from 50% up to 75%. Now I have 75% retention rate.
Mhm.
I know that's a
Mhm.
good improvement.
Mhm.
You know, and yeah, yeah. So I absolutely appreciate that answer and appreciate your perspective on that side.
Sure.
So. So you have seen leadership development up close for a very long time. What do you think still needs to change in the way we design these programs, especially for the leaders in the middle?
So I think it comes down to, in many cases, instructional objectives, having really clear instructional objectives, and not necessarily that like the programs um, need to, the program itself has to have clear outcomes. I always think that that's one of the challenges for many internal teams. Um, and I think a lot of organizations end up doing leader development, without a clear outcome, without a clear expectation of what do we expect these leaders to do. I have a little article coming out in ETD's blog series, and I want to say probably next week, last week of September, um, that kind of looks at some lessons from AI interventions. And one of the surprising things is MIT released a study that showed that like less than 5% of AI interventions, AI adoptions are resulting in some sort of ROI, a positive ROI. And there were a couple of takeaways in that paper, one of which was that organizations that had used outside vendors didn't try to build the AI themselves, that had, you know, used an outside vendor and then had a very clear objective around what the tool was supposed to do. They saw ROI in those situations. They saw positives, and they got positive results, more positive results than others. And to me, that resonated a lot because I see this all the time. An organization will say, "Well, we need this new initiative." They feel like, they we have an internal team has to add this new initiative, and they don't really have an idea around why it has to be there. And so I think this happens a lot with leader development, where we just need to teach people how to lead. We're not really sure what the outcomes are going to be for leaders, and that means that you didn't look at the leaders that are in the organization right now that are successful to say, okay, this is the approach we want to take. These are the things that we expect leaders in our organization to do. And so I think that's one of the big things that has to change in order for organizations to move forward in the future, and really gain the most benefit from leader development programs, is to be really clear about what those outcomes are going to be. And that clarity helps the learners and the folks going through the program, because then they're like, okay, I know what I'm supposed to learn. I'm going to practice these skills, and then now what I learned is relevant to what I'm going to do in the work, so I'm going to carry that over. So that I think is one of the big things that needs to change.
Yeah. And just to follow up with that side
Mhm.
too, for organizational development professionals,
Mhm.
what are some of the skill sets that you would recommend that they focus on as they're determining what some of these objectives might be, or some of the outcomes might be.
Mhm.
I know that there are programs out there, but
Mhm.
what are some of the skill sets that you think that and informal? They don't have to be formal skill sets, but
Mhm.
some of those skill sets that organizational development professionals should focus on when
Mhm.
they're starting to develop these particular programs.
I think one of the most important skills that you have to have in any kind of consulting is active listening. I think sometimes in OD and in leader development, what happens is we have certain things that we want. My leader development program has to have the following things, but that's not organizational development. That's not going to make the organization better necessarily. Your goal should be to hear what the client is saying, whether it's an internal or an external client, and then say, okay, where does my program, my idea fit into that? Can I confirm that this is actually the real problem? Because in some cases, leaders in an organization, they're not 100% sure what the challenge is, what the problem is, and I think that's the real key is listening, and then saying, well, okay, can I put together, can I put together the needs of the business, my own personal needs as a OD professional or learning development professional. How do I, bridge that gap between those two things, and then how do I design a program appropriately from that? I think sometimes, especially if you just came out of school, you learned all this stuff. You're just like, I know what the correct answer is. It was in a book I read, but that's not really what the book's trying to tell you, right? Like there's an approach that you need to use, and you have to kind of find balance between those two things. And if you've read Peter Block's Flawless Consulting or the ATD Handbook for Consulting, you'll see it's the same idea that like active listening, really paying attention to the needs of the client, and then the needs of the organization will guide your hand in developing that organization.
That's great. And active listening is such an underrated, but such a valuable skill to have. And I was talking to somebody about active listening recently on the show too, and it's, it does, it kind of like, it doesn't just work within organizations. If you're a good active listener outside of organization, if you're a good active listener at home, okay, with your spouse or your family, your sister, brother, whatever, it makes those relationships stronger. But absolutely internally, being able to really hear what the needs are, to really be able to sit down and yes, when we get out of school and and we move into these organizations, yes, we have the tools necessary and the knowledge necessary, to be able to say, okay, this is what needs to get done.
Mhm.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what the organization needs, and that's where that those active listening skills come
Mhm.
in. So
Mhm.
absolutely. So, Sai, so I have to ask you, and I'm gonna tell you, I'm a huge fan. But so you have written books connecting leadership to Marvel and Avatar: The Last Airbender, and it's really fun and accessible way in to that. So, what made you use pop culture to teach leadership lessons?
So I think one of the big things is like, one of my other roles is I'm a professor, and I teach IO psychology and organizational behavior to a lot of undergraduates and some graduate students, but mostly undergraduates. And for undergraduate students, they have like no clue what I'm talking about in a lot of cases. If I'm talking about organizational behavior, talking about organizational development, IO, any of those topics, they're just kind of like, well, I work at Subway. I don't know what that means, right? Or I am a lifeguard. I don't know how this relates to me. And so what I found was that if I showed a clip of something, that would help students learn. And so one of the first things I ever wrote about with pop culture is I had a whole list of resources for human resources courses, organizational behavior classes, and IO classes, of clips from the show Parks and Recreation, where people could like, oh, here's an example of this kind of leadership. Here's an example of work-life balance that's not working, and here's something we can talk about. And that kind of ballooned into my executive coaching work, where if you've worked with executives before, they're reading all the time. They're like engaged in high level thought often. And when I first started doing executive coaching, I would assign like, papers, HBR articles, and things like that. And I got a little bit of pushback, like, oh, I don't know when I'm going to be able to read it. I would have sessions where the coachee was like, I didn't get a chance to read this thing that you asked me to read. And one thing I found was that if I asked them to watch a TV show, or if I asked them to watch like a movie, they were a little bit more amenable to that. They were like, well, okay, this, I don't, I would have to give them questions or things to look for in the movie or in the TV show, but that was something that they were more open to, and it seemed easier. I don't actually think it's easier, but it felt easier. I'm gonna just sit back and watch this. Um, and that's where the genesis of this came from. And then my buddy Gordon Schmidt, he wanted to submit to this series that exploring effective leadership in popular culture series from Emerald Publishing. And he was like, "Hey, we're both fans of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Do you want to submit this?" I'm like, "Sure." And then out of that came the Avatar: The Last Airbender book as well. But it's been um like something that I've been thinking about for a really long time, and then I just watch a lot of stuff. So it was just natural for me. But like I think that teaching it to people who aren't in organizations has been very helpful. Teaching it to students who don't have a ton of experience, in the world of work, other than sort of like really frontline jobs that are far away from those corporate decision makers. It allowed me to say, like, okay, if we want to see what leadership looks like, we want to see what stress or burnout looks like, here's what we've got. Here's something that'll illustrate this idea. So for example, there's an episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender they show in my organizational behavior class where we talk about stress, burnout, and team dynamics. And I give them, I'd say, hey, here's some questions. I want you to watch the episode, and then we're gonna talk about them, and that helps to illustrate it. It doesn't work for everybody. I will warn anybody listening that if you're at a very serious organization, and if you're like, hey, let's watch this children's cartoon together, you're not gonna that contract is either gonna get canceled or you're not gonna get renewed. So you have to pick your spots for it. But for the organizations that are open to it, and for the executives that are open to it, I think they do gain some serious benefit from it.
And see, for me, I'm a pop culture person, so
Mhm.
I love that approach, and it is such a really great and accessible approach because
Sure.
it integrates something that we're doing anyway. A lot of us do watch some television. I love Ted Lasso. I mean, you can
Uh-huh.
learn leadership skills from Ted Lasso, what
Sure.
works and what doesn't work. I mean, you can learn about the workplace in Severance, the TV show.
Mm.
I mean, that's just directly workplace. So I mean, there's a lot to unpack in that
Mhm.
series there.
Mhm.
But I mean, it's such a great approach and such an accessible approach to be able to convey those the leadership messages and
Mhm.
everything that you're conveying, because really, like you're saying, from a new person's perspective, the technical terms, they might not land, and if it's more accessible, through other world experience where they can empathize, they can see, and they can say, "Oh, okay, yes, this makes sense to me." It really does connect within the individual at an earlier level, which sets the groundwork or sets the foundation for their career. Instead of trying to train individuals that might be 20, 30, 40 years into their career and don't have the skill set or haven't been trained on the skill set, and trying to change those habits. You're
Mhm.
setting that
Mhm.
foundation, and I think that is absolutely wonderful. Because it for those individuals that see that, um, they start to look for it in other areas. At least I
Mhm.
assume so.
Mhm.
They start to
Mhm.
look for it in other areas, and
Sure.
it's the introduction, in the MCU, or the Avatar: Last Airbender, but then it moves, like I was saying, it moves into like Ted Lasso, it moves into Severance, it moves into other TV shows that you might be watching, that you can take
Sure.
some of these lessons. You know, I'm gonna tell people, like, don't be only looking for that when you're watching. Like, enjoy your TV shows, but know that, like, those lessons are
Mhm.
there for you.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
um, so yeah, so let's just pivot just a little bit here. So, when we look at this, so every consultant has had a moment where something sounded good but didn't quite land in the real world. Is there a lesson you learned the hard way when it comes to developing leaders?
Yeah, actually, there's one of the biggest one of the biggest challenges that I faced in my own leadership experience is well, twofold. One is related to like whether or not leaders are willing to kind of give of themselves in the leadership development programs, and that includes whether that's classroom, whether that's coaching. Getting them to buy in is really difficult. And what I've found is, you know, in some cases, like I try to use humor and I try to use pop culture to connect with people. And sometimes it doesn't land. And so one of my biggest lessons has been to start very professional and to like be really serious about that work, rather than being like, oh, haha, we're gonna have fun. To saying like, no, we're gonna be serious about this leadership work. We'll grow to have the fun, rather than saying like, okay, because what happens sometimes is even in the coaching sessions or in the leader development, if you're doing like a multi session course, if you don't start with that seriousness in the beginning, what I find is that sometimes the leaders may not take it seriously. The participants in the program may not take it seriously. Even though from my perspective, I would think like, oh, this person's just trying to make things enjoyable for me and trying to make the medicine go down with with a little flavor. um we don't see that necessarily in leaders. Sometimes are like, well, I guess this is fun and playtime and we can just talk about whatever. But I think having that seriousness around it is important. And even in delivering feedback, delivering results of surveys, I think that's really important with client organizations to take it really seriously, maybe be a little bit more formal, and then grow with that over time.
That's great advice for individual, especially if you're not aware or not familiar with the organization and how the organization works. I mean, as a consultant, I know as a consultant that, when we're in those talks, those initial talks, and we're getting that information, there's still that guard, there's still that wall that's up there because, the stakeholders that we're talking to, they don't want to, they don't want to admit that things are wrong sometimes, and they don't want to admit that the culture is maybe needs a little bit of improvement here or there, and they don't allude to what it really potentially looks like, and not all clients, but a lot of them, are going to be guarded at first.
Mhm, mhm,
So exactly what you're saying too, like take it seriously, and then integrate some of those, really feel it out almost to see how the leaders within those
mhm.
organizations are going to be receptive to it.
Yeah.
And I know for myself too, like I when I'm giving presentations and stuff, when I'm doing at the conferences, I try to be, as serious as I can because I never know who's listening. So I try to be as serious as I can be. But once I've gotten to know the groups, I'm a goofball. Like I just, we'll start cracking jokes, like, but
Mhm,
they know, like,
mhm.
this is the seriousness of it. So,
Yeah.
working within an organization for 5 years, they know, like, in the very beginning, like, this is what we're doing. But yeah, I get to be a little goofy and, just, make my references and, kind of joke around a little bit
Mhm,
so that we
mhm,
know that in leadership that we don't always have to take ourselves really, really seriously. It's
mhm,
leadership should be fun. It
mhm,
shouldn't be just, oh yes, I need to do this and I need to do that. It should be fun. There should be some joy to it.
mhm,
Especially when we talk about leading people and we get to see, our team members' growth and, providing them with opportunities and everything like that. There should be joy in that. And I think that's where we some of the leaders tend to forget that a little bit,
mhm,
so.
mhm,
But yes, your approach in there is exactly the same type of approach I take.
mhm,
And it's such great advice for not just consultants, but those that are starting to develop or starting to approach their upper leaders and getting that
mhm,
buy-in, that approval,
mhm,
approach them from a serious perspective. This is what needs to get done.
mhm,
Going back to what we were talking about before, these are the objectives. These are the outcomes that we're looking to achieve. This is the data that has been collected to find out those pain points.
mhm,
And this is, what we want to do, taking it very
mhm,
seriously and then working,
mhm,
kind of setting that framework, setting that foundation in there.
mhm.
So, yeah, thank you. I appreciate that, Sai. Um, so you have worked with some pretty big names, from Fortune 100 companies to sports teams. But in all of those experiences, what's one leadership quality that you think flies under the radar but makes a huge difference? And I know we talked about active listening before,
Mhm.
but what's something that you think really just flies under the radar?
Uh, this maybe doesn't fly under the radar, but it's just something that we assume about leaders and about organizations. I would say integrity, and I don't mean that in the sense that the person has the characteristic. I mean the active action of like maintaining promises and being respect. Like if you're saying something to your employees, kind of saying like, okay, I'm gonna do X, and if you don't do X, give me an explanation as to why that didn't happen. Is I think it is really important. So maintaining that level of integrity is a key, and that goes, that works for sports, that goes for Fortune 100 companies, it goes for everybody, even small medium sized businesses. You need leaders that are living up to the promises that they're making and maintaining that level of integrity. So integrity is sort of like a practice. Um, Letting leaders know, and it cuts. Usually when I talk about leadership, I talk about leadership in these two big buckets of task stuff and relationship stuff. And for me, integrity and maintaining integrity kind of fits into both of those boxes, right? So if you are not, if you're not maintaining integrity within your group, within your team, you're probably not following up on the work very well or consistently. And if you're not maintaining integrity in the work, then you're probably not treating people as well as you probably should. So I think that's one of those things that like you really, as an organization, you want to maintain that. And at the individual level, as a leader, somebody who's accountable to other people, I think that becomes really important. And is a valuable way to kind of talk about leadership in organizations of almost any size.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I that the concept of integrity and the leaders that I know that I've followed and that I've really, just related to are those leaders that have that high level of integrity, that say what they're gonna, that do what they're gonna say, or do what they say,
Mhm.
that, follow through on, excuse me, follow through on the work, follow through on doing. Those are the leaders that I'm drawn to. So, and those are the leaders that if I know you have a high level of integrity, all other leadership skills can be learned, and all other leadership skills, will follow suit. And I know that integrity is a practice. And I know that, when we explore individually our personal values, I think that that's one that like each individual should really explore, and then really look at putting maybe in their top five. I say top three, but top five. We'll
Mhm.
say, even if you get it into your top 10, that'll be great.
Yeah.
But really looking at that from a personal values perspective, as
Mhm.
opposed to just a leadership perspective,
Mhm.
because it really does create, and a high level of integrity absolutely can create the inspiration around your team members,
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
again, you want your team members to model what you're doing. I mean, that's what it is. They're going to model what you're doing anyway.
Mhm.
And if you have you don't have integrity, you don't have, ethics or anything like that, your team members are going to model that. And if you want your team members to have a high level of integrity, you have to model that. You have to believe in that. And I think that's such a great thing for the listeners to hear
Mhm.
is, I mean, when we talk about leadership skills and we talk about, leadership qualities and everything, we hear oh, be a good communicator, be, good active listener, be a this, but integrity is so crucial just to ourselves,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So thank you, Sai. I appreciate that. So we are going to wrap things up here, Sai, and I am going to ask you if you had to sum up your approach to leadership and development in just a phrase or a one-liner, what would that sound like? Something you'd want someone to actually carry with them after hearing this conversation.
Well, I think we've been talking about this a lot, but I would say call your shots, and I mean that. I mean that in the sense of in pool, you have to call your shot before you take the shot. And I think leadership development has to call their shots. Like, what do you expect people to learn? What do you expect to teach? And that is a clarifying question for a lot of people. Rather than just being like, well, they just have to be a leader, whatever the generic definition happens to be, by forcing yourself to say, okay, let's call our shot. Here's what the program's going to look like. Here's what the outcomes are going to be. That helps you to design a more effective program, and it helps you to create, better material in the program because it's tailored to that question. So yeah, calling your shot, I think, is really important. And actually, it goes back to, when we were talking earlier about people taking chances. I guess shoot your shot too. Like, take the chance that you think that you wanna take.
Sai, thank you. This has been such a wonderful episode and a wonderful conversation. And for me, it's I'm still super excited about it. So thank you so much for being here. Now, can people connect with you on LinkedIn?
Sure. Yeah, people can
Okay.
connect with me on LinkedIn. They can check out the Talentmetrics website, talentmetrics.io. They can find LinkedIn is probably the best place to find me. And then if they have questions, they can reach out. Happy to answer any questions that they might have. And then you can find my books on Amazon. So
Yeah, and I'll have all those links in the show notes. So, and I know that you are speaking at ATD Org Dev in October. For those of you that are in organizational development, if you are going to ATD Org Dev, please be sure you go to Sai's session. It will be, it, I'm sure it will be wonderful, as they always are. And for many of you that are, that are in the OD space, please be sure to connect with Sai, because Sai doesn't speak only at ATD Org Dev. I know he's done sessions at SciUp. Sai does quite a few presentations and quite a few speaking engagements throughout the course of the year. Absolutely connect with him on LinkedIn, and he'll be able to provide some of that information for you as well. Again, Sai, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day.
thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
That was my conversation with Dr. Sai Islam, and I have to say, what a meaningful discussion it was. His insights on leadership development, middle management, and the real-world application of data remind us that OD is as much about people as it is about process. I'm grateful to Sai for taking the time to share his experience and perspective, and for continuing to make the field of organizational development more accessible, engaging, and human-centered. If you'd like to connect with Dr. Islam, you can find him on LinkedIn or visit his company's website at talentmetrics.io. His books, Leaders Assemble and The Elements of Leadership, are available through Emerald Publishing and on Amazon. All of those links are in the show notes. And for more conversations like this, you can follow Unboxing OD wherever you listen to podcasts, or head to www.pearsonpearson.llc to learn more about my consulting work, the Flow of 5 Tiers, and our new self-paced course, the 21-Day Leadership Realignment, designed to help you reconnect with your values, clarity, and presence in leadership. Thank you for spending time with me today. Till next time, keep listening deeply, keep leading with integrity, and keep unboxing what's possible in your workplace. Take care.